The slap wasn't the worst part, it was the sound of it. A sharp, dry crack that seemed to swallow the gentle chirping of the sparrows in the old oak tree. Margaret Maggie Sullivan didn't cry out. Her head snapped to the side, her silver bun coming slightly loose, a few wisps of hair falling across her temple. She brought her hands up, not to strike back, but to clutch her old smartphone to her chest, as if it were a lifeline. The device, with its cracked case, looked absurdly fragile in that moment. "Just give me the damn code, you old bat," the young man growled. He was maybe 19, wearing a blue varsity jacket with yellow sleeves that seemed to scream of a faded, borrowed glory. His name was Kyle. He leaned into her space, his athletic frame towering over her slight one, blocking the afternoon sun that usually warmed her porch. The smell of cheap cologne and aggression washed over her. Behind him, his friend, a lankier boy named Jason, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting up and down the quiet suburban street. "Kyle, man, maybe just take the purse," he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. "She transferred it all to her phone. She said that," Kyle spat, not taking his eyes off Maggie. "I saw her do it at the bank. Digital wallet, it's all right in there." He gestured with a clenched fist at the device she held. "You think you're smart, huh?" Maggie's eyes, a faded blue that had once been the color of a summer lake, met his. There was fear there, a cold, trembling fear that settled in her bones. But beneath it something else flickered, a deep, weary recognition. This wasn't just about money. This was about the porch she kept swept, the geraniums she watered every morning, the quiet dignity of her 78 years. All of it meant nothing to the empty fury in this boy's eyes. He needed to erase it, to prove that none of it mattered. He shoved her, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make her stumble back against her own front door. The vintage glass pane in the top rattled. Her hip flared with an old arthritis pain. A small, desperate sound escaped her lips. That sound seemed to fuel Kyle. A cruel smile touched his mouth. "See? That's all you are. A noise." He reached for her arm, his fingers digging into the thin cotton of her cardigan, aiming to pry the phone from her grasp. That's when Maggie stopped looking at him. She looked down at her phone. Her hands, veined and speckled with age, shook, but her thumbs moved with a focus that shut out the looming threat, shut out the pain. She navigated to her recent calls. She found the name at the top, not 9111, another number, a contact saved simply as Michael. She pressed the call button and raised the phone to her ear, her gaze now fixed on a point somewhere past Kyle's shoulder, past the neat lawns of Maple Creek Drive, to something only she could see. Kyle laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Who you gonna call? The cops? They'll be here in 20 minutes. We'll be long gone. Give me the phone." The line rang once, twice. Maggie's voice, when she finally spoke, was a thin, clear thread in the thick air of the porch. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a plea, it was a statement, simple and devastating. "Michael," she said, "they're hurting me, son, on the porch." Kyle's laughter died, replaced by a sneer. "Son? You called your son?" He looked back at Jason, who managed a weak, nervous grin. "What's he gonna do, Maggie? Drive over with a casserole? Maybe he'll wag his finger at us." Maggie didn't answer. She listened to the voice on the other end of the line for a second longer, then let the phone drop slightly from her ear. She didn't hang up, she just held it, the open line now a silent witness in her hand. "He's on his way," she said quietly. There was no triumph in her tone, only a profound, bone-deep sadness. "Fantastic," Kyle said, his bravado momentarily shaken by her strange calm. He recovered quickly, grabbing for the phone again. This time his fingers closed around her wrist. It was thin, breakable. "We'll be gone before he even finds his car keys. Now let go." Maggie held on. It wasn't a fight of strength, she had none, it was a fight of will. Her knuckles turned white, the plastic case of the phone creaked. She looked at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. "He was always a quiet boy," she said, her voice almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Never liked bullies." Something in her tone, the disconnect between the violence of the moment and the soft reminiscence of her words, made Kyle hesitate for a fraction of a second. It was long enough. From down the street, the low growl of an engine cut through the suburban stillness. It wasn't the smooth purr of a sedan or the rumble of a truck. It was a raw, mechanical sound, like something that had been driven hard and far without rest. Both boys' heads turned. A vehicle, a dusty, unmarked black SUV with tinted windows so dark they seemed to swallow the light, rounded the corner. It didn't speed. It moved with a predatory, deliberate pace, rolling to a stop not at the curb in front of Maggie's house, but angled across the end of her driveway, blocking it. No one got out. The engine cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Jason took a full step back, off the porch and onto the first step down. "Kyle," he whispered, the word barely audible. Kyle's grip on Maggie's wrist loosened, but he didn't let go. His eyes were fixed on the SUV. "So what?" he said, his voice louder than necessary. "It's one guy." The driver's door opened. A man unfolded himself from the vehicle. He wasn't overly tall, maybe 6 feet, but he was built with a dense, compact solidity that spoke of function, not show. He wore faded khaki cargo pants, scuffed boots, and a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across his shoulders. He had close-cropped brown hair and a face that was neither young nor old, but etched with a calm that seemed completely alien to the scene on the porch. This was Michael Sullivan, Maggie's son. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He closed the car door with a soft thunk and began walking up the sidewalk, his boots making almost no sound on the concrete. His eyes took in everything: the position of the boys, his mother's posture, the way she held her phone, the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide from him. He didn't look angry. He looked assessing. Michael reached the foot of the porch steps. He stopped there, looking up. His gaze settled on Kyle's hand, which was still encircling his mother's wrist. "You're on my mother's porch," Michael said. His voice was low, flat, devoid of inflection. It wasn't a question. It was a factual observation with the weight of a verdict. 5 minutes earlier, Maggie Sullivan had been deadheading her geraniums. The soil was cool under her fingers, the late afternoon sun a gentle warmth on her back. This was her ritual, her meditation. The porch was her sanctuary. She'd lived in this house for 42 years, raised her son here, buried her husband from here. Every scratch on the floorboard, every chip in the paint held a memory. She'd seen the two boys loitering by the park sign at the end of the street earlier. She'd noticed the blue varsity jacket. She knew of Kyle Jenkins by reputation, a star athlete whose star had fallen hard after a knee injury last season. The town talked, in that way small towns do, about the anger, the slipping grades, the minor brushes with the law. She'd felt a pang of sympathy then, for a boy whose future had narrowed so painfully and so fast. That sympathy had evaporated an hour later when she returned from her weekly trip to the bank. She'd been cautious, always, since Frank passed. She used the digital banking tools her son had patiently set up for her, transferring the modest weekly cash she allowed herself to her phone. It felt safer than carrying cash. She hadn't noticed the car idling 2 spots down. They'd followed her home. Confronted her the moment her key was in the lock. The demand was simple, crude: give us the money. She'd refused, her stubborn Irish pride flaring. That's when the shove had come. Then the slap, the rapid dehumanization from Mrs. Sullivan to Old Bat in the span of 60 seconds. Now, as her son stood at the foot of the steps, that same stubborn pride warred with a mother's primal fear, not for herself, but for him. She knew what Michael was, or rather she knew the outline of it. He was a senior master sergeant in the Army. He worked in communications and logistics, he told her. He was often gone, his location unspecified, his calls infrequent but always heartfelt. He came home quiet, quieter than he'd left, with a new stillness behind his eyes. He would spend days just fixing things around the house, the loose gutter, the creaky stair, his hands engaged in simple reparative work. She'd never asked for details. She'd seen the controlled way he moved, the absolute lack of wasted energy. She'd noticed how he always sat facing the door in a restaurant. She'd found a nondescript black kit in his closet once, its contents orderly and unidentifiable. She had her suspicions, nurtured from whispered conversations with other military mothers and late-night internet searches that she always closed with a prayer. She called him, in the secret chambers of her heart, her quiet warrior, and now her quiet warrior was home, and he was looking at Kyle's hand on her arm. "Let go of my mother," Michael said. The words were still calm, but they carried a new edge, a finality. Kyle, his bravado fueled by adrenaline and the need to save face in front of Jason, tightened his grip instead. "Or what? You gonna call the cops, old man?" Michael didn't move. "The police have been notified. They are approximately 17 minutes away given current dispatch patterns." He said it like he was reading from a report. "That's a long time. Now, for the last time, let go." The precision of the information, the 17 minutes, threw Kyle. It wasn't a bluff. It was a statement of reality. His eyes flickered to the SUV, to Michael's posture, to the terrifying stillness of the man. The math in his head was changing. This wasn't a scared old woman and a slow police response anymore. His fingers uncurled. Maggie pulled her arm back, cradling the wrist, the phone still clutched in her other hand. She took a small, shuffling step back towards her front door, her eyes locked on her son. Not on her assailants, but on her son. She was watching him. Michael's gaze followed her movement, ensuring she was clear, before returning to Kyle. "You're Kyle Jenkins," he said. "You live on Sycamore. Your mother works at the elementary school cafeteria. Your father drives a rig for long hauls. He's currently in Nevada." Kyle's face went pale. "How do you— You're wearing your Letterman jacket," Michael continued, as if explaining something simple. "It has your name sewn inside the collar. The rest is a Google search and a town Facebook group away. You're not a ghost. You're a kid who made a catastrophically bad decision on his own doorstep." He took one step up onto the porch, not aggressively, but it shifted the space, putting him on level ground. He was now between the boys and his mother. "You think this is about money?" Michael asked, his voice dropping even lower, forcing them to listen. "It's not. You can steal money from a store. You assaulted a human being on her own property. You looked her in the eye and chose to cause fear and pain. That's a different category of choice." Jason from the steps, his voice trembling, said, "We didn't mean. We just—" Michael's eyes cut to him. "You just what? You just thought it would be easy? You just thought there'd be no consequence for you, that she didn't matter?" He looked back at Kyle. "That's the real crime here. The assumption that she doesn't matter." In the distance, the first faint warble of a police siren began to sound, cutting through the thick tension. It was still miles away. 17 minutes had never felt so short or so long. The siren grew louder, a rising and falling wail that seemed to pull at the threads of the afternoon. For Jason, it was a relief, a tangible end to the nightmare. He visibly sagged, his body slumping into the posture of surrender. For Kyle, it had the opposite effect. The sound was a trigger, the final proof of his failure, the anchor dragging his already sinking world into the depths. His eyes, wide with a panic that had morphed from cruelty to desperation, darted from Michael's impassive face to the approaching street. The calculus of escape overrode everything else. He couldn't be here when the cops arrived. A shove, a slap, a threat. It would be his word against an old lady's, but with this grim, factual man as a witness? And his record? No. With a sudden, choked cry that was more animal than human, Kyle lunged, not at Michael but to the side, aiming to vault over the porch railing and cut across the neighboring lawn. He never made it. Michael's movement was a study in efficient motion. There was no wind-up, no dramatic flourish. He simply shifted his weight, his left arm coming up in a short, sharp arc. His forearm met Kyle's chest, not with a crushing blow, but with a perfectly timed redirecting force that used the boy's own momentum against him. It wasn't to hurt, it was to stop. Kyle stumbled backward, his legs tangling, and sat down hard on the porch floorboards, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs in a loud whoosh. He sat there, gasping, more shocked by the sheer ease of his defeat than by any pain. Michael stood over him, not advancing. "Sit!" he commanded, the single word leaving no room for argument. He then turned his head slightly toward his mother, who was still by the door. "Mom, go inside and wait by the front window. Keep the door open, but go inside." Maggie hesitated for only a second. She saw the look in his eye, not anger, but a focused operational control. This was him handling a situation. She nodded, a small, tight movement, and slipped inside, positioning herself where she could see, but was out of the immediate space. Michael turned his attention back to the two boys. The siren was close now, just a street or two over. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Kyle, who was still struggling to get his breath back. "Listen to me," Michael said, his voice low and intense. "The police are going to put you in handcuffs. They're going to put you in the back of a car. They're going to take you to the station. This is happening. Your choice now isn't about escaping that. Your choice is about what happens after." Kyle glared, hatred and shame burning in his eyes. "You can play the tough guy," Michael continued, relentless. "You can lie. You can say she fell. You can say I attacked you. That's a path. It leads to more anger, more resistance, a harder fall later." He paused, letting the sounds of the approaching cruiser fill the void. "Or you can tell the truth. The whole ugly, shameful truth. You can look at what you did, and you can own it. That path is harder right now. It's humiliating. But it's the only path that leads anywhere other than where you're already headed." He stood up as two police cruisers, lights flashing, pulled up sharply to the curb. Officers emerged, their hands resting on their belts, assessing the scene. A calm man on a porch, a kid on the ground, another kid frozen on the steps, an elderly woman watching from a doorway. Michael took several steps back, raising his hands to shoulder height, palms out, a picture of non-threatening cooperation. "Michael Sullivan, the homeowner's son," he called out, his voice clear and steady. "These two men assaulted my mother and attempted to rob her. She is inside, unharmed but shaken. I have intervened and detained them until your arrival." The formality of his words, the clear narrative, immediately de-escalated the officer's posture. They approached, and the next few minutes were a blur of questions, quiet explanations from Maggie at the door, and the grim, metallic click of handcuffs. As the officers led Kyle to a car, he looked back over his shoulder, not at Michael, but at Maggie, standing in the frame of her front door. Her face was pale, but her eyes held his. There was no gloating there, no victory, just a deep, sorrowful exhaustion. In that moment, he didn't see a victim. He saw a mirror reflecting back the utter smallness of what he'd done. He looked away, ducking his head as he was guided into the back seat. The cruisers pulled away, the lights still spinning but the sirens now silent. The unnatural quiet of the neighborhood rushed back in. Michael stood on the porch watching them go. Only when the taillights disappeared around the corner did his shoulders drop, the operational mask slipping away. He turned and walked to his mother. "Let me see your wrist," he said softly. Inside, the familiar world of her kitchen, the checkered curtains, the humming refrigerator, the faint smell of lemon polish, felt different. It had been violated. The sanctuary had been breached. Maggie sat at the oak table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea Michael had made. She watched as he moved through the room with a quiet, deliberate energy, checking the front door lock, peering out the side window, then finally coming to sit across from her. He took her left wrist gently in his hands. His fingers, calloused and strong, were impossibly tender as they probed the red marks left by Kyle's grip. "Nothing broken," he murmured, "just bruised." He held her hand for a moment longer, then let go, his own hand briefly covering hers on the table. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." "You were here exactly when you needed to be," Maggie said, her voice firmer now. How did you get here so fast? You were 6 hours away yesterday." Michael leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. He seemed to be weighing his words, choosing a truth he could share. "I was on my way back already. A training exercise wrapped up early. I was about an hour out when you called." He didn't mention the driving speed that had cut that hour in half. He didn't mention the cold, clear focus that had descended on him the moment he heard her voice, a focus honed in far more dangerous places than Maple Creek Drive. "Mom, this digital wallet thing, it's supposed to be safer, but it also makes you a target if someone's watching. We need to talk about a different system." She waved a dismissive hand, then winced at the tenderness in her wrist. "It's not the system's fault, Michael, it's the emptiness in that boy's eyes. He wasn't just after money, he was after proof that nothing matters, that kindness doesn't matter, that tending your garden doesn't matter, that growing old with dignity doesn't matter." Her eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of a profound grief for that emptiness. That's what hurt the most. Michael was silent for a long time. He looked at his mother, really looked at her. He saw the strength it took to grieve for your attacker. He saw the lifetime of love and loss etched on her face. And for the first time since he'd gotten out of the SUV, a different kind of emotion broke through the professional calm. It was a deep, roaring protectiveness, mixed with a helpless anger, not at the boys, but at a world that could produce such a moment on this porch, at this table. "It matters," he said finally, his voice rough. "Every bit of it matters." He took a deep breath. "The police will want you to press charges. There will be a court date. It will be invasive, draining. We can talk to the DA about a plea, but what they did, it's a felony. It's serious." Maggie nodded, sipping her tea. "I know, and he hesitated, a rare thing for him. "I need to tell you something about what I do, what I really do." Maggie looked up, her gaze steady. "You don't have to, Michael." "I think I do," he said. "After today, you should know." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man diffusing a complex device. "I'm not in communications. I'm assigned to a special missions unit. We handle problems, very specific, very difficult problems, all over the world. I've been to places I can't name, done things I can't talk about. The reason I'm so good at what I did out there today is because it's a smaller, simpler version of my job. Assess, control, resolve." He watched her face, waiting for fear, for shock, for disapproval. Maggie simply reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was paper-thin, warm from the mug. "I've always known you were a guardian, Michael. I just didn't know the scale." She gave his hand a squeeze. "My quiet warrior." He bowed his head, a wave of emotion hitting him that was more powerful than any combat stress. Her unconditional understanding was a greater weight and a greater comfort than he could ever express. She said softly, pulling back and composing herself, "We press charges, we go to court, we tell the truth." She looked toward the porch, as if she could still see the ghosts of the afternoon there. "And maybe, somehow, we make sure that boy understands that what he tried to destroy on this porch today is the only thing that can actually save him." The midpoint had been reached. The attack was over, but the real story was just beginning. The path of easy revenge was closed. They had chosen, together, the harder path of truth and consequence. There was no going back. The Maple Creek Courthouse was a modest brick building that smelled of floor wax and anxious sweat. The following weeks were a slow, grinding procession of procedures. Maggie, with Michael always a silent, solid presence beside her, gave her statement multiple times, to detectives, to the district attorneys, young, earnest assistant, and finally in a preliminary hearing, before a judge. Kyle Jenkins, through a public defender, pleaded not guilty initially. The strategy was clear: create doubt, paint Maggie as a confused elderly woman, frame the encounter as a misunderstanding that Michael had escalated. It was the path of resistance Michael had warned him about. Then the DA's office played the audio. Michael, in the moment he'd called out to the arriving police, had stated that his mother was unharmed but shaken. It was a strategic, calming phrase for law enforcement. But Maggie's phone, which had remained on an open line from the moment she called Michael until the police secured the scene, had captured everything. The DA's techs had recovered it. The audio was damning. The dry crack of the slap, Kyle's voice, "Just give me the damn code, you old bat." The threat in his tone. The sound of her stumble against the door. His cruel, mocking laugh when she called her son. In the sterile quiet of the courtroom, the audio was more violent than any reenactment could be. It laid bare the casual cruelty of the act. Kyle, in a cheap suit that didn't fit, seemed to shrink with every passing second of the recording. His mother, sitting in the back row of the public gallery, began to cry silently, her hand over her mouth. When it finished, the judge, a stern woman with silver-rimmed glasses, adjusted her robes and looked at Kyle's public defender. "Does your client wish to change his plea?" The facade crumbled. The path of resistance had hit a wall of undeniable truth. Kyle whispered to his lawyer, then stood, his shoulders hunched. "Guilty," he said, the word barely audible. He pleaded guilty to felony assault and attempted robbery. Jason, who had cooperated fully from the moment he was in the police car, took a plea deal to a lesser charge. The judge scheduled sentencing for 8 weeks later, ordering a pre-sentencing investigation and victim impact statements. As they left the courtroom, Michael saw Kyle's mother approach Maggie. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began, her voice thick, "I am so ashamed. I don't know what to say. I failed him. After the injury, the scholarship gone, I didn't know how to reach him." Maggie looked at the woman, seeing not the parent of her attacker, but another mother drowning in a different kind of pain. "We all fail sometimes," Maggie said quietly. "It's what we do after that matters." Is there anything?" Kyle's mother asked, a desperate hope flickering in her eyes. "Anything we can do?" Maggie glanced at Michael, then back. "The court will decide his sentence. That's the law. What happens after that? That's up to him. And maybe," she added, "to people who haven't given up on him." It was not forgiveness. It was a crack in the door, left open not for Kyle's sake, but for the principle that people, even those who do terrible things, should not be utterly discarded. Michael, whose world operated in starker binaries, felt a tension in his jaw. But he respected his mother's choice. This was her justice to define. On the drive home, Michael finally spoke. "You were gracious back there, more than I would have been." Maggie stared out the window at the passing town. "It's not about grace, Michael. It's about exhaustion. Anger is so heavy, I'm too old to carry it, and that boy, he's already carrying enough weight to sink him forever. My adding to it won't change what he did. It'll just make 2 broken people instead of 1. Michael was silent, contemplating the complex moral algebra his mother practiced so instinctively. For him, Justice had always been about containment and consequence. For her, it seemed to be about healing, even when the wound was inflicted by the one who needed healing most. It was a perspective shift that would define the difficult weeks to come. The sentencing hearing arrived with the first chill of autumn. The pre-sentence report was a bleak document. It detailed Kyle's fall from grace, his unaddressed anger, his previous misdemeanors for vandalism and public disturbance. It also noted his cooperation after the plea, and his expression of remorse, which the report's author deemed superficial and self-pitying. The recommendation was for a substantial prison sentence. The courtroom felt different this time. Heavier, final. Kyle, in a county jumpsuit now, looked younger and more broken. The judge asked if the victims wished to make a statement. Michael stood first. He walked to the lectern, his posture straight, his voice clear and carrying. He did not speak of anger, he spoke of cost. "Your Honor," he began, "my mother's physical injuries healed. The bruise on her wrist is gone. But the injury to her sense of safety in her own home, a home she has loved and cared for over 40 years, may never fully heal. Every creak on the porch at night now has a different meaning. That is a cost. My cost is the knowledge that while I am away, serving this country, the people I love most are vulnerable to this kind of senseless violence. That is a cost." He turned and looked directly at Kyle. "You wanted to prove that nothing matters. You failed. What my mother built on that porch, the life she lived, matters immensely. It mattered enough for me to drive halfway across the state. It mattered enough for her to show up here today. Your actions have a cost, Kyle. Today the court will begin to make you pay that cost. But the debt you owe to your own humanity, that's one only you can settle." He returned to his seat, his message delivered. Accountability without theatrical revenge. Then Maggie stood. She moved slowly to the lectern, a small figure in a simple blue dress. She adjusted the microphone downward and folded her hands on the wood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice soft but clear, "everyone in this room has talked about what Kyle took from me. I'd like to talk about what he gave me." A ripple of confusion went through the room. The judge leaned forward slightly. "He gave me a very ugly, very clear picture of a pain I didn't want to see," Maggie continued. "The pain of a young man who feels so worthless, so without a future, that the only power he can feel is taking power from a 78-year-old woman. That is a profound, devastating poverty of spirit." She looked at Kyle, who was staring at the floor. "I don't want you in prison forever, Kyle. I think that would just be more of the same emptiness that led you to my porch, just in a cage. But you cannot be allowed to believe that what you did is without severe consequence. You must be held accountable, and you must be given the opportunity, the obligation to rebuild, to build something real, not steal the illusion of it." She turned back to the judge. "I cannot suggest a sentence. That is your duty. But I will say this. Whatever time is served, I hope it includes a mandate for education, for counseling, for hard work that teaches the value of creating rather than taking. Punishment that only breaks someone further serves no one. Punishment that forces a person to confront the wreckage they've made of their own life. That might be the first real thing they've had to face in a long time." She returned to her seat. The courtroom was utterly silent. The judge removed her glasses, polished them slowly, and put them back on. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, "you have been afforded every protection of the law. You have been found guilty of a serious violent felony. The pre-sentence report paints a picture of a downward spiral with no attempt to correct course. However, the victim's statement is noteworthy." She pronounced a sentence that was less than the maximum, but far from lenient, 5 to 8 years in state prison, with a strong recommendation for placement in a facility with a vocational and substance abuse program. She also stipulated that upon parole, he would be subject to community service, the nature of which would be determined by a probation officer. It was a sentence that held the weight of the crime but left a narrow path forward, exactly as Maggie had implicitly asked for. Justice had been served, but it was a justice that looked toward a possible difficult future, not just a punitive past. As the bailiff led Kyle away, he finally looked up. His eyes met Maggie's for a fleeting second. There was no gratitude there, not yet, but there was a flicker of something besides defiant emptiness. It was confusion, the bafflement of someone who has struck out expecting hatred and has been met instead with a devastating, unyielding clarity. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The bully was now in the grip of the system. The victim had become the unlikely author of a narrative he didn't know how to read. The following year passed with a quiet rhythm. Michael extended his leave, then made the difficult decision to transition out of active duty. The world of problems overseas would continue, but his most important mission, he realized, was here, on Maple Creek Drive. He took a job as a security consultant for a local firm, his skills translating into a stable, home-based life. He and his mother never spoke directly of the attack, but its presence was in the new security system he installed, in the way he always made sure she was settled before he went to his own apartment nearby, in the shared, comfortable silence that had deepened between them. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived for Maggie. It was on cheap lined paper, postmarked from the state correctional facility. The handwriting was awkward, deliberate. Mrs. Sullivan, they make us take this class on restorative justice. We have to write to the people we hurt if we want to be considered for the vocational program. My counselor says I should be honest, not just say what they want to hear. So here's the honest truth. For a long time, I hated you. I thought you ruined my life. I told myself you were just a rich old lady who could afford to lose some cash. I told myself your son was a psycho. It was easier than thinking about what I did. I'm in the woodshop program here. I'm good at it. The instructor says I have hands for detail work. We made birdhouses last month. It was stupid, but I liked it. Making something, it felt different. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm writing because what you said in court about the poverty of spirit, I think about that a lot. That's what I had. That's what I was, empty and poor. I'm trying to build something in here, not just birdhouses. I'm trying to build a reason to not be that person anymore. It's hard. Most days I don't know how. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because you were the only one who didn't just see a monster. You saw the poverty. And for some reason that feels worse and more important than just being hated. Kyle Jenkins' Maggie read the letter 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table. She showed it to Michael that evening. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," Maggie said carefully, "he's starting to pay the debt he owes himself. That's the harder one." "Do you write back?" She thought for a long moment. "Yes, but not today. He needs to sit with this, and so do I." She waited a week. Then, on a Sunday morning, she wrote her reply on her best stationery. "Kyle, thank you for your letter. I'm glad to hear you are in the woodshop program. Creation is a powerful antidote to destruction. You are correct that I do not see a monster. I see a young man who made monstrous choices. There is a difference. The first is irredeemable. The second is capable of change, but the work is his alone. The poverty you describe is one many people feel. Filling it with things taken from others only deepens the hole. Filling it with skills earned, with respect for yourself and others, is the only way out. It is the hardest work you will ever do. I will not offer you empty forgiveness. That is a gift given when the giver is ready, not a transaction. But I will offer you this, my hope that you continue to build. Build skill. Build character. Build a life you do not have to steal from others. Sincerely, Margaret Sullivan. She mailed it and did not expect or receive a reply, but a few months later, a small, carefully wrapped package arrived. Inside was a simple, beautifully crafted cedar birdhouse. with a clean-lined roof and a perfectly round entrance hole. There was no note. Maggie took it outside. She and Michael looked at it, then at each other. Without a word, Michael got a ladder and a nail. He hung it from a branch of the old oak tree, overlooking the porch, where the geraniums were just beginning to bloom again. It was not a happy ending. It was an acknowledgement, a small wooden symbol of a difficult, ongoing process. The win was not in Kyle's redemption. That was a story still being written and might never be finished. The win was in Maggie's unwavering hold on her own humanity and in the fragile possibility she had left open for him to reclaim his. The porch was a sanctuary again. But it was a sanctuary that now held the memory of a storm, and a quiet, steadfast belief that even shattered things could be mended, piece by difficult piece. Another year turned. The birdhouse weathered to a soft silver gray. Sparrows and chickadees made it their home, their busy comings and goings a constant gentle animation outside the kitchen window. Michael was in the backyard teaching his mother how to properly plant tulip bulbs for the spring. Deep enough so the squirrels can't smell them, he instructed, his hand guiding hers on the trowel. You'd think after 79 years I'd know how to plant a flower, Maggie grumbled, but she was smiling. Just making sure my skills stay sharp, he teased. The phone rang inside. Maggie dusted the soil from her hands and went in to answer it. It was the district attorney's office. Kyle Jenkins, having served 3 years of his sentence with a clean disciplinary record and completion of multiple vocational programs, was up for his first parole hearing. As the victim, Maggie was entitled to give a statement, either in person or in writing. She listened, thanked the caller, and hung up. She stood at the window, watching the birds at the feeder Kyle had built. Michael came in, wiping his hands. Who was it? She told him. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What will you do? Maggie was silent for a long time, watching the sparrows. I think, she said slowly, I will write a letter to the parole board. I will tell them that while the memory of that day will never leave me, I have no desire to see a life warehoused in perpetuity. I will tell them I have received correspondence that indicates genuine, if nascent, self-reflection. I will say that I defer to their judgment on his readiness, but that I believe in the purpose of parole, supervised reintegration, not endless punishment. Michael nodded. It was a measured, fair, profoundly Maggie response. No one would blame you if you asked them to keep him in. I know, she said. But that would be about my fear, not about justice. Justice has been served. What happens next is about mercy, and mercy must be earned, but it also must be possible. Otherwise, what are any of us working toward? She sat down at the table and began to write. Her letter was concise, factual, and rooted in the same principle that had guided her from the moment Michael arrived on the porch, a belief in consequence, but also in the fragile potential for change. Weeks later, they received notice that parole had been granted, with strict conditions including ongoing counseling, mandatory employment, and 300 hours of community service, specifically with a program that repaired homes for low-income seniors. On the day of his release, Maggie and Michael did not go to the prison gates. There was no dramatic meeting. Their part of the story, the active part, was over. They had done what was right, not what was easy. They had held the line of accountability and, in doing so, had drawn a map back to humanity for a lost young man. Whether he chose to follow it was now his burden and his choice. That evening, Maggie sat on her porch swing, a blanket over her knees. Michael sat on the steps, sharpening a garden tool. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Do you ever wonder, Maggie asked softly, if it made a difference? All of it. The court, the letters, the birdhouse. Michael stopped his sharpening, the rhythmic scrape ceasing. He looked out at the quiet street, at the birdhouse in the tree. It made a difference to you, he said. You sleep through the night now. You leave the door unlocked when you're gardening. That's a difference. He paused. It made a difference to me. I learned that the hardest missions aren't about stopping a threat, They're about rebuilding what's left after the threat is gone. That's the longer fight. And for him? Maggie pressed. Michael was quiet for a long time. We may never know, Mom, and maybe that's okay. We controlled what we could. We offered a path. The walking is his job. He went back to sharpening the sound, a gentle punctuation in the twilight. But I'll tell you this, that kid who shoved you on this porch 3 years ago? He's gone. The person who took his place might be better, or he might just be emptier in a different way. But he's not the same, and change, even uncertain change, is a form of difference. Maggie nodded, satisfied. It was not a neat ending. It was real. It was layered with pain, patience, and a hard-won peace. The story had never been about a Delta Force son delivering instant karma. It was about an elderly woman's quiet, formidable courage. The courage to press charges, to face her attacker in court, to speak a painful truth, and finally, to carefully, conditionally, allow for the possibility of a future beyond the crime. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sky darkened. It illuminated the swing, the steps, the thriving geraniums, and the simple wooden birdhouse, a silent testament to a terrible day and the fragile human bridges built in its long aftermath. From which part of the country are you watching this story?